Greetings and welcome to the first episode of the new era of the Medical Update Show on YouTube. I'm your host, Walt Culbertson, and I am so pleased that you joined us for this very special first episode. After more than 2 decades on Comcast Cable in Jacksonville with more or less a captive audience, we're loose, we're free, and we're roaming about outside the studio shooting on location around Florida and beyond. If you're a frequent watcher on Comcast, I'm going to jazz up these new episodes with special cutaways and graphics I couldn't do in the studio. I am going to, however, keep the same 30-minute, more or less, Q&A format featuring 1 or 2 guests covering a variety of healthcare medical subjects and topics. I want to cover, however, what you want to learn, so please visit the medicalupdateshow.com website. I welcome your comments, suggestions, and ideas for future episodes. I will also post additional content and links related to today's program and prior episodes, as well as showcase what's coming and opportunities for you, my friend, to be the next Medical Update Show star. And please remember, click on that thumbs up button and give us a big like, subscribe to the channel, and I'll keep those medical updates coming your way. With that and no further ado, as this intro has already taken half the show, let's get at it. I had planned to start this new YouTube journey with a healthcare story and footage I shot while in Australia, but a larger story has loomed over the world and our nation. COVID-19 has changed almost every aspect of our daily lives, but there is light. At the end of the tunnel, my friends, the cavalry is on the way. In recent weeks, Pfizer and Moderna have been approved by the FDA, and AstraZeneca is close behind. Other promising vaccines as well are in the pipeline. But each of these vaccines comes with its own unique opportunities and in some cases side effects and delivery challenges. Here to help us work through these questions with insights and wisdom, only one of the very talented physicians and researchers on the COVID front lines of the vaccine trials could provide is Dr. Michael Koren. Dr. Koren is a practicing cardiologist and the CEO of the Jacksonville Center for Clinical Research, where we're filming today. They conduct clinical trials at 8 locations in Florida. Dr. Koren received his medical degree cum laude from Harvard Medical School, and he completed his residency in internal medicine and a fellowship in cardiology at New York Hospital, Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, and the Cornell Medical Center. But I also have to share, my friends, I've had this 12-year relationship with Dr. Koren. We don't talk about it much because, we only get to see each other maybe once a year. But now before your mind gets to wandering and you get to thinking, I think I've seen this movie before. Well, who would have thought, although I should have, that my very own cardiologist would go on to become such a renowned medical researcher. He's a mover, he's a shaker, he's a shot giver, and he is a lifesaver. Please welcome the one, the only Dr. Michael Koren. Welcome.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, and I will be bold enough to take my mask off given your inspirational word.
All righty then. Well, I have to share, Dr. Koren, in all the years I've been your patient, how many times I tried to get you on the Medical Update Show. I have to tell you, Doc, you got out of that exam room faster than I usually try to.
Well, it's always been my pleasure, and it's been my intention to be part of your program. So thank you for asking.
Well, I greatly appreciate you being here, and times have most certainly changed, Dr. Koren. Tell us a little bit about how you became involved on the clinical research side of healthcare.
I've always loved research. So I'll share with you a crazy anecdote. When I was in high school, one of my professors, I guess was just a teacher then, not really a professor in high school, said that he thought I had the sensibilities to use my business mind with my scientific mind and come up with something. And here we are at Jacksonville Center for Clinical Research, which is actually a model for getting research out to the community, to help community doctors get involved in doing research and help patients that are regular, everyday folks get involved in clinical trials.
And here we sit inside that successful combination of your clinical and business talent. Now, you conduct many different types of clinical trials here besides COVID, correct?
We do. We are, as we speak, running 150 trials in many different therapeutic areas. In diabetes, in obesity, in orthopedics, in neurology, you name it, we're probably involved in those trials. And basically what we need is to find physicians who are dedicated, that are good at what they do, and a patient population that would be interested in participating in the world of clinical trials, which is a really neat world that I'm sure we'll be exploring today.
Was that one of the reasons you were selected to conduct the COVID trials?
It is, as a matter of fact. So because of our organization and the reputation of it, and the fact that I've been very involved in education about clinical trials, outreach into different communities, including underrepresented communities, and due to the fact that I know how to conduct clinical trials with a really great team, we were picked. And it was a pretty prestigious honor. There's only about 100 centers in the country that were asked to participate in the COVID-19 studies, at least the first round. Yeah.
Well, you are clearly the right person to help us dive into this that has changed, and taken so many lives. But COVID seems so different than any other virus. I may have it and not even know it. If I get it, I may suffer lingering side effects that last for months, maybe years, we don't know yet, or I may lose my life. This thing seems to be so different than anything else we've seen before.
Sure. It isn't, and it isn't. So I and this entire show just explaining the history of different viruses and in COVID, but you bring up an interesting point. So COVID is a coronavirus, and coronaviruses have been around for a long time. Most coronaviruses do not infect humans. They actually do not have the capability of infecting humans because they can't get into human cells. Periodically, coronaviruses will mutate in a way or change or have a different arrangement of their proteins in a way that allows them to actually infect human cells. And that's what happened with COVID-19. This is also called COVID SARS-2 because the SARS virus has been something that we've dealt with in the past. And there is a structural relationship between that virus and COVID-19. COVID-19 is a RNA virus, meaning that RNA provides the genetic material for the virus. Influenza is an RNA virus. Influenza is something that is the general term for the family of viruses, just the way coronaviruses are a family of viruses. One type of influenza, if you say influenza A, or if you say the H1N1 flu, those sorts of things, those are specific viruses within the influenza family, just the way COVID-19 is a specific virus inside of the coronavirus family. So just to put that out there, some of this is just nomenclature, but it's very, very important. So when you say that we've never had this before, well, we have. So 100 years ago, we were dealing with the, quote, Spanish flu, which is a type of influenza virus that was much more virulent than the average flu virus. And it resulted in probably the equivalent of 1 million people dying at a point in this country's history where our population was maybe 35% of what it was today. So it was actually far more devastating in terms of morbidity and mortality. But what's really interesting when you compare them is that it points to the fact that every virus has different characteristics. So back in 1918, when the Spanish flu was rampant, we found that younger people were particularly vulnerable to the morbidity and mortality effects of the virus. So one very interesting anecdote from back then was that military recruits who were young, healthy men who were infected with influenza at that time were in these makeshift military hospitals, basically 10 hospitals. And there was one study in Massachusetts that showed in a group of 14,000 recruits who got sick that 700 of them died. 700 young men between age 18 and 24 died, which is about 5%. So you compare that with COVID-19, where the characteristics are very different. Young people seem to have very minor illnesses. Not all, some people get pretty sick, but if you look at the likelihood of dying, if you're 24 years or less from COVID-19, that number is less than 1 in 4,000. If you're between, say, 55 and 65 and you get infected with COVID-19, your likelihood of dying is about 1 in 40. When you get to 85 years old, your likelihood of dying of COVID-19 is 1 in 4. So that's a characteristic of the virus, to get back to your original question, which is completely different than other major flu epidemics or other major RNA viruses that have infected the population in a major way.
I always assumed looking at the Spanish flu, it was more a function of the lack of technology, meaning that we have medicines and clinical techniques and facilities that we didn't have back then. So you're saying that didn't have anything to do with it?
Why did older people do better during the Spanish flu? So there was a 5 to 7% mortality in young, healthy men then. And if you got older, you seemed to have much less of an issue. So it probably had a lot less to do with, quote, technology and a lot more to do with epidemiology. So there's a very good chance that those young, healthy men had not been exposed to any viruses that were even similar to that, whereas older people may have been exposed to a flu virus in the past that allowed their bodies to create better immunity. And the young, healthy men were not. They had massive infections. Then their immune system overreacted and they went into shock or had other very serious consequences because of the inflammatory cascade.
Well, that definitely wasn't the answer I was expecting, but, the magic still comes back to vaccines. So how do vaccines work?
So fortunately, we have responded magnificently from the standpoint of the medical community and come up with many, many ideas in terms of how to deal with this problem by getting vaccinated. And I can give you a long story about the history of vaccines, but what I will say is that there has never been in the history of mankind this much manpower and resources put into figuring out a problem. And it also has corresponded to a time where our understanding of science has progressed to the point where we can actually use genetics to create vaccines in ways we never could do before and come up with solutions that have been now shown to be safe and effective. The vaccines that have been produced that have never been produced before actually use what's called RNA technology. It's an RNA platform. And interestingly, I like to tell people about this, is that RNA technology is actually, quote, natural. Like when people think about a flu shot or other things, they think, oh, that's some crazy stuff that people are cooking up that's completely unnatural. But it's not true, because our body is constantly making these little RNA messages to tell our cells what to do. That's the way our bodies work. They're constantly interacting. So the nucleus of the cell, the DNA is sending an RNA signal, and RNA signals are going back and forth. And RNA signals are actually the way our bodies naturally fight viruses. So who would have thought that we can now give our bodies an RNA signal and our body would know how to fight the virus? And that's basically how these RNA platforms work, is we get a little piece of RNA, a little bit of a fat molecule, gives it to our bodies, it gets to our cells, and our cells say, okay, this is the spike protein I need to fight against. And they go ahead and do it.
Well, that is certainly fascinating. So how is the RNA approach so different than everything else we're doing today? For example, the influenza vaccine.
Sure. So historically, influenza vaccines and other vaccines like that were basically made by growing the virus. So you would grow influenza virus. You would typically grow it in large vats. Historically, that would usually be some sort of egg type of vehicle that was used to grow the virus. Remember, viruses are such simple organisms that they can't exist by themselves. They need to be in a cell of some sort in order to use the capabilities of that cell to reproduce themselves. So they have to grow in another cell. So again, typically eggs would be the cell. You grow a bunch of virus, and then you have to isolate that virus from the medium that you're using to grow it. Then you have to inactivate that virus. Then you have to take that virus out and decide you're going to give the whole virus or just parts of that virus, and go through further iterations to make sure that you have a relatively pure thing, which is very, very difficult to do. So there's a series of steps to purify it and eventually put it into some sort of vehicle that you inject into people. And that's historically the way things are done. There have obviously been different iterations and different innovations over time, but they involve growing a virus. And then we'll get back to COVID-19, and there are certain vaccines that have been developed that involve growing a particular virus, but that's how things are done historically. The other thing about influenza, as I mentioned, is that you never know what strain of influenza is going to hit a community. So it's a bit of guesswork. So when you hear something called the quadrivalent flu vaccine, it means that the vaccine is geared against 4 potential strains of influenza virus that all can be, somewhat different from each other, with the concept that we're hoping that we hit the right strains for any particular season, but knowing that there may not be even one single strain in a flu season in one particular part of the world.
Now, do you anticipate that with coronavirus, COVID-19, meaning that it's going to morph and change, and will it come back next year?
Possibly. So it's a really good question. So keep in mind a couple things. Number one, COVID-19 is one type of coronavirus. So it's like the question you're asking, will the H1N1 flu come back next year? Well, there'll be other coronaviruses, of course, but not necessarily this nasty H1N1 strain that caused a lot of problems. The other thing to keep in mind is that coronaviruses typically do not infect human cells. So if COVID-19 mutates, it may mutate to a form that's actually less lethal, less able to penetrate human cells. So let's be optimistic. And quite frankly, that's the more likely scenario, in my opinion, just because coronaviruses tend to not infect human cells. The other part is that the vaccines that are developed against the part of COVID-19 that's required for infection into human cells. So not to get too technical, we actually know how the spike protein will interface with a receptor on human cells called the ACE2 receptor. And if you block the ability of that spike protein to meet the ACE2 receptor in a normal way, then you block the ability of the virus to get into a human cell.
Well, that is amazing. So we have different vaccines between Pfizer and Moderna and AstraZeneca and so forth. How are they all different?
Yeah, so it's amazing. So as I mentioned, there was a huge number of resources put in. At last count, I think there were 145 vaccine candidates that were submitted to the WHO for registration.
Just in the U.S.?
No, all over the world. WHO is an international organization, and about a dozen of them are in serious clinical trials. And I'm not going to go through every one of them, but I'll go through the ones that are kind of most ahead, that most of the people who listen to this broadcast would potentially be hearing about. So the one that's furthest ahead in the US is the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine. Pfizer is obviously a big international pharmaceutical company. BioNTech is a biotech out of Germany. They've gotten together and they've created a vaccine that involves using RNA technology against the spike protein. And they develop it in a way that there is multiple antibodies that are created to hit the spike protein in different ways. So the theoretical benefit of that is that even if the spike protein mutated a little bit, the different antibodies would make up for that. There's a lot of overlap there to prevent that spike protein from getting into human cells. This has been done in a way that's completely unprecedented. 44,000 patients were involved in the studies, a large number of those in the US. We've been very involved in these trials, and they submitted their information to the Food and Drug Administration in record time, showing that the vaccine was 95% plus effective and safe.
Now, some of the challenges with the Pfizer vaccine, as I've heard, is it requires 2 doses and has to be kept in extremely, extremely cold temperatures.
It is a vaccine that requires 2 doses as of now, day 1, day 21. And it's a vaccine that, based on clinical trial experience, needs to be kept in a highly frozen state, minus 70 degrees or lower. So that creates some potential logistical issues that has to be shipped on dry ice and has to be kept in facilities that have refrigeration equipment that allows that to accommodate the way it's been distributed so far in clinical trials.
Has that ever been done before?
There's certainly products that are delivered at minus 70. I can't think of a product that will be delivered this widespread at minus 70. Close on the heels is the Moderna product, which was also a very robust, very large clinical trial that I participated in as a clinical investigator, that our organization participated in, that did a fabulous job, mostly US-based. So that, again, involves 2 doses of the vaccine, again, messenger RNA platform. The advantage potentially is that it can be shipped frozen, not, quote, deep frozen. So it can be in just a sort of a standard freezer rather than a minus 70 degree freezer, and the shelf life would be longer in a freezer. So there is the possibility that it'll have less logistical challenges.
So both use a similar messenger RNA technology and both have to be kept cold, but you're saying just, Moderna not quite as cold as Pfizer.
Well, they both have to be kept very cold. One has to be kept super duper cold. Okay, so because when you get to the AstraZeneca, you'll find something else. So again, Moderna frozen, think of just Pfizer as deep frozen, minus 70 versus just frozen.
So then, do you see logistical challenges with both of them?
No. Again, in fairness, the FDA will give us guidance on how it actually has to get distributed. And there may be data that gets presented to show that, well, the vaccines are pretty much equivalent. And even though that's how we did things in the clinical trials, that's not necessarily how we have to do things when we distribute it more broadly. We don't know yet. We just don't know.
Gotcha.
And by the time people have reviewed this, we may have more details about it. So keep your ears open. and maybe we can do a follow-up presentation.
I'll get the opportunity to get you back on the medical update show again.
And then both of those again use the messenger RNA platform, which is not injecting a virus. AstraZeneca with the Oxford group has also reported an effective vaccine, not quite as effective as the others, but that actually involves injecting a virus. So it's actually an adenovirus, which is a different type of virus that comes from chimpanzees that has been modified to accept other genes in it. So very, very clever technology, but basically they were able to put the COVID-19 genes to produce the spike protein inside this non-replicating adenovirus and use that as a way to get the cells to produce the spike protein, which in turn turns on the immune response. So it does involve a virus, which maybe is a little less favorable in terms of just the thinking about it, but it is believed to be safe. It seems to be effective, maybe not quite as effective as the others, although there's a little controversy around that, which we can get into if we have the time. But it only needs to be shipped refrigerated. It doesn't even need to be frozen. So because of that, the logistics will be simpler and the cost should be way less than the other two that require more sophisticated logistics. It's still a two-dose vaccine, and that's been studied more outside of the US than inside the US, about 60,000 folks as we speak outside of the US, with much smaller trials inside the US. But they've promised to do another trial now just inside the US to look more closely at the efficacy and to see how competitive it will be against the messenger RNA platforms. And then there are other companies, Johnson & Johnson, through their Janssen division being also something worthy of mention, has done most of their work outside of the US again, even though it's a US company. And they are also promising a vaccine that will be based on an inactivated virus, but they're thinking that they may even be able to provide their vaccine with just one dose. They're a little bit behind the others, but that may be logistically even more feasible because technically it may be just something that you refrigerate and you just take one dose. But we don't have any data yet from them on the efficacy of that, so we're still waiting that. And then there's also Novavax, which is another company. Again, there are many, but these are the five I'm mentioning, the ones that are most ahead, that has completed or is in the process, I should say, of a larger overseas trial. I think it was 18,000 people that's about to launch their US trial. And again, this doesn't involve injecting a virus, but in fact, injecting a genetically manufactured spike protein with something called an adjuvant. So the concept here is you just give a very, very small amount of a purely synthesized spike protein, which can be done based on recombinant genetic technology, and then give a substance so that the immune system recognizes it right away, and you don't have to give a lot of that protein. So again, you're not giving the virus, so it can't reproduce in you, but it's a very interesting concept to get people to become immune to the coronavirus based on just introducing a little piece of the spike protein.
Well, all this is wonderful news, Dr. Koren, but if we already have two vaccines that have been approved, and it sounds like one that's very close, why keep developing more vaccines?
Well, good question. So there'll still be issues about trying to bend the cost curve down. Obviously, we're looking at providing literally billions and billions and billions of doses, and are there vaccines that can be produced less expensively with less costly logistical systems? Obviously, if you're thinking about getting vaccines to Africa and in poorer parts of the world, Southeast Asia, for example, India, places with a lot of people, but maybe not the same infrastructure that we have in the West, even refrigeration is a challenge. So if there are better and better ways to get vaccines that can be produced inexpensively that don't require a lot of logistics, then that would be one reason to do it. Obviously, there's also national pride. So I didn't mention the Russian vaccine or the Chinese vaccine, or there's some universities that have developed their vaccine. And it's a matter of pride that they're able to develop a vaccine, and how that plays out in the commercial world, I don't know, but I would imagine that if you're in Russia, there's a pretty good chance you can get the Russian vaccine. And maybe if you're in China, there's a good chance you get the Chinese vaccine. I don't know. So there are other issues in different parts of the world that will play themselves out. And some people amongst that group of 145 will say, geez, well, we had a really good idea for developing a vaccine, but we got beat to the punch, and we'll just drop this and not move it forward. So at the end of the day, I think that we'll probably be looking at, a good 4 to 10 candidate vaccines that people have the opportunity to choose from. Sometimes the choice will be made by your insurance company or by what's available, but no, the chances the consumer may have that opportunity to decide.
Well, that's still a difficult decision between the differing approaches of each of these vaccines as you're sharing today. And, when I go to the pharmacy to get a flu shot, I'm not given a choice between flu shot A, B, C, or D.
Well, you could, but you don't. So that's a whole nother story, is like, why don't you? And because usually you just trust the system to do it. But a simple thing is, do you get flu mist, which is a nasal vaccine and don't get injected, or do you get a shot? Well, right now, flu mist is only approved, I think, for people over 65, I'm not mistaken. It may be 60, but it was developed in older people. But actually, if you're 65 years or older, you have a choice. And, most people will not really think about it. They'll just go there and kind of go with the flow. But the fact is that there are different manufacturers of flu vaccines, and there's actually different ways of getting flu vaccine.
Well, I don't think I really knew that or ever thought about it. I just know I show up at my pharmacy or doctor and they give me a flu shot. We don't discuss any of this.
And most people in most situations will just trust the system to provide that. But in fact, you have a choice about flu shots, and you will almost certainly have a choice with COVID-19. Although, again, if you go to, I'm just making this up, if you go to CVS, they may say, well, we have a deal with Pfizer. You go to Walgreens, we have a deal with Moderna. There'll be stuff like that happens that you have to sort through. And the good news is that all the products I mentioned seem to be very safe and effective.
Well, I think more often than not, it's really going to be up to the insurance company deciding what most Americans get. So let's start to wind things down by returning where we started. Go figure. Can you take a few minutes and describe for us the clinical trial process?
Sure. Well, it's a very cool and very nurturing process. So we are approached all the time by different entities. It could be pharmaceutical companies, it could be the government, it could be private equity firms looking to understand things, and they're called the sponsors, and they'll say, okay, we want to look at a particular medical issue, and we want you to help us solve it. And this could involve a drug or a vaccine or a test or just a process. And when you do a clinical trial, you have a protocol which tells you how you're going to go about it, and you do a very, very rigorous way of scientifically testing that question. So, for example, is drug A better than drug B? Well, you hire a site like ours, an organization like ours, and we look at the protocol. We say, yes, we think that we can help you answer this question. And then we invite folks from the community to be part of it. And although you're part of the scientific process as a member of the community, there are also tangible benefits for you as a patient. So you come in, you get people that look at your medical history very carefully. We advise you whether or not you're a good candidate for the program to begin with. We tell you, what the possible pluses and possible minuses of participating in the study. You may get some of the benefits from the medication. You may not. You may have the opportunity to be in a long-term extension program if the medication works for you. You may get paid for your participation. Typically, we like to make sure that there's some fees available for the patient so that any cost that gets incurred in terms of traveling, et cetera, is reimbursed. And it's a fun process. So you get to meet really super nice people and talk about your health situation and be part of the future. There's a great legacy effect to be part of this. And a lot of people come in that have done multiple projects and say, hey, I helped Lipitor get on the market and that saved millions of lives.
Sign me up.
Yeah, it's really cool. It's a really, really fun process. And there's like the little stigma of, quote, guinea pig, being a guinea pig, which is a little bit different than what it used to be because we know so much more scientifically than we used to. That even before we do broad clinical testing, we know a good deal about the safety. And there's all kinds of backstops to make sure that these opportunities are safe. And quite frankly, on average, if you participate in a clinical trial, your likelihood of doing better medically is greater than if you did not participate in a clinical trial.
Well, yeah, they're getting free medical care.
You're getting medical care, you're being observed, people are learning things. There's always tidbits that we pick up on that will help people for the future. So chances are you'll do better in a clinical trial than you would otherwise if you have a particular condition.
Now, for your trials, did you use a placebo or a control group?
Some do and some don't. So a control group is different than a placebo. Placebo means it's an inactive control group. but the control group can be another drug. The control group can be another process. Control group can be, quote, usual care. So depending on the nature of the experiment, there is either a placebo-controlled element to it, or there is just a controlled element to it. Or there are some studies that are just observational studies, which is also important. So here you may not even know what you're getting. And what we're asking you to do is to record your experience over a period of time. So we have those trials as well.
So what about the COVID clinical trials? How did you actually conduct those?
So the COVID-19 vaccine studies that we participated in were placebo-controlled studies.
And what does that mean?
Meaning that we participated in the Pfizer BioNTech study, as well as the Moderna studies. And in those particular trials, you had an equal likelihood of getting real vaccines or placebo injection.
So if I'm in the group that's given a placebo, something inert, won't I really know that if I've been given saline instead of, the real vaccine?
I think, but you often don't. And one of the reasons you don't is because the active product was really, really well tolerated. So again, you don't know until the process is over, but once you participate in a clinical trial, you're kind of in a good position to be at the head of the line. We can't guarantee that, but typically we look out for our folks, and the sponsors, the manufacturers look out for people. So if you participate in a clinical trial and you're in the placebo group, you will often get the opportunity to get the active product once it's gone through FDA scrutiny.
Now, from what I've read of the process, it seems what you've been doing is giving half the group the real vaccine, the other half of the group a placebo, sending them back out into their normal world, and then seeing who gets infected.
That's exactly what we did. Yes. And in the case of the vaccines, there was a remarkable difference. So just to use round numbers, I know the exact numbers, but I won't use them for confidentiality reasons. But this has been publicly reported both for Moderna and Pfizer, 95% plus. So that means that in the placebo group, for every 100 patients that gets COVID, how many get it in the vaccinated group? So just think about this for a second. For both Moderna and the Pfizer programs, for every 100 people in the placebo group that got COVID, only 5 got it in the vaccinated group. And the 5 that got in the vaccinated group tend to have less serious illnesses. So the most serious illnesses almost always occur in people who are unvaccinated. I'll also remind you, maybe even as a closing note, that there's only 2 ways to become immune to a virus. Either get the disease or get the vaccine.
Well, there is certainly truth in that, Dr. Koren. And speaking of getting vaccines, this has been wonderful news you shared today after the year 2020 turned out to be. And I had also promised you beforehand, by the way, this would be a quick half hour. But the good news is I'm not going to get that hook pulling us off the soundstage for running over time. So let's do our first ever medical update show, overtime edition, because there is a subject I want to cover. While you have shared such wonderful news today on so many fronts, it's going to be a while before the vaccines ramp up. And I am continued to be dismayed that 1 year almost into this pandemic, we still have so many questions about these things. From masks do work to masks don't work to some work, some don't. Given our opportunity to have such an expert here today, can you give us some insights into these and how they work and the difference between them?
So yeah, there's a lot of misconception. I'll just tell you a quick funny story, just so people understand how masks have just become this political controversy and people don't talk about them as a tool. They're really tools. So I was in the gym, and my gym is a socially distanced place, but they have a mask mandatory session. And so I stumbled upon the mask mandatory session because it was a different time than I usually go to the gym. So they said, Dr. Koren, you have to wear a mask for the session. I said, okay, that's fine. So I go there, I get on my bike, and I'm messing around with masks. I think I actually had the N95 mask. So this is the good medical mask, and I'm wearing it, and I'm starting to do my thing. And I'm noticing, which is typical, that when you breathe through a mask, a really good medical mask, which is an N95 mask, the pores are very small, so there's a little bit more work of breathing. And that's known. And when you exercise, then it takes a little bit more effort to exercise with a mask on than without it. So I'm just adjusting my mask, and somebody comes up to me, "Oh, make sure you're wearing a mask." I said, "Okay, I'm wearing my mask." And then, of course, knowing what I know, I said, "Yeah, I'm just trying to decide if I should wear the N95 mask or a paper mask, and the paper mask has bigger pores, so it's a little bit easier to breathe through, but it's still considered acceptable. But it's not as good as this mask.
So now, these are a new style than 95 masks. But most of us are used to seeing that bubble that fits over your face with the strap over the back of the head and the neck. And I've actually had friends tell me this can't really work because it does have loops around the ears.
No, these are great little masks. So you have one, I have one. Again, it has to do with the pore size. So again, viruses are really, really small. So if the pores are too big, like in a paper mask, they can actually get through. Where I guess they call gaiters or whatever those cloth things are, the FDA has actually said that they may not be very effective at all because the pores in those fabrics can be big enough to allow virus through. And then you have something like this, which is a completely impermeable barrier. So if somebody sneezes on me and I'm wearing this, and that has COVID, of course, as good as this is, it's going to get on my face and my hair and other things. Of course, I'm going to touch my face and eventually I'll get infected.
So that also seems it would protect our eyes, which a mask is not protecting.
Yeah, that's concerning. Anywhere. So doing this, it makes it less likely that anything's going to get through this impermeable barrier. I have a place to breathe, so it's actually the work of breathing is easier. So in some ways, this is actually a better protection for people.
But the thing about those is they're open on the side.
It's open on the sides, but again, the virus, let's say I have the virus, and I cough, it's going to hit this, and it's just going to fall down. And it'll be in my body and whatnot, but it's going to protect you. And so, again, there's two ways of thinking about it. Is like, one, if I'm infected and I don't know it, or I'm infected and I know it, how do I protect other people? Obviously, if you're infected and you know it, please stay at home and get away from us. But some people don't know it. And so this is actually pretty good. But there's less guidance about using something like this, which is in some ways more effective. So when I'm in the hospital, I'll wear my paper mask, which is easier for me to breathe through, and this, and I think I'm doing a pretty good job. But anyhow, just to finish it up with a funny story of how people react without necessarily wanting to hear the facts. So I'm in the gym. This is a few months ago, and I'm trying to decide how to adjust my mask to do my exercise, and I'm saying like masks cause harder work of breathing, so you have to kind of manage that. The work of breathing against what's good. And again, some of this is just cosmetic anyway because I am like 20 feet away from everybody else. But yeah, so one woman, she hears me talking to one of the technicians in the gym, and she comes up to me, yeah, you're absolutely right. This whole thing is a big joke, and as soon as the election goes, no one will be talking about masks or the virus anymore. That's what she comes up to me. I said, no, this is not a big joke. This is like a serious, serious problem. I'm just telling you about the technical elements of a mask. So, and she came at me from one side. So then I'm getting going. And then literally 5 minutes later, another guy comes up to me. He says, you know why we have such a big problem with COVID-19? Because people like you that won't wear their masks right. I said, what are you talking about? So it's funny. So it's just become this, your focus of sort of political / philosophical points of view rather than really thinking about how they work. So again, paper mask, decent, it'll help you a little bit, but the pore size can allow viruses to go in or out. N95, much smaller, pores, it's going to be better, especially if you have COVID inadvertently, it's going to really block any virus from getting through, protect you a little bit better from somebody that's on you, but it's not going to protect the rest of your face, which is all vulnerable. And then this, which is completely impermeable, okay? But the other thing is that, getting into the technical parts of it, I see people shopping. I was at a big box store on Black Friday, and I did a little survey. 6 out of the 20 people who I ran across were wearing a mask like this. That's not going to do a whole lot, but that's what people are doing. And then I was watching college football, and I saw the coaches. They were wearing their masks, and then they go showing how compliant they are with it. And then they have to yell something to the quarterback, and they say, 1462. So like the time they actually need to wear the mask, they take it off, and they're projecting and spitting and something. Right. So the mask, they throw it off to yell something at their quarterback. And when they're sitting by themselves in the sideline, they're wearing And when they're screaming at the top of their lungs, they're not wearing the mask. So there's a lot of dysfunction out there, and hopefully the vaccine will make this a distant memory in the near future.
Well, I have to tell you, Doc, it is kind of stylish on you. And hey, when you're done with all this, you can become a welder.
What can I say?
Well, Dr. Koren, thank you so much for being on the show today and being the opening act for this new era of the Medical Update Show on YouTube. You've been extremely insightful and helpful, and I know you have given so much information on this critically important topic, and I'm going to hold you on getting you back on another episode of the Medical Update Show.
Sounds great. Well, thank you for having me, Walt. It's always a pleasure.
Well, my friends, this has been the first ever YouTube edition of the Medical Update Show. I'm so pleased you joined us. I hope you'll keep coming back. Please hit that thumbs up button, give us a big like. Remember to subscribe to the channel so we can stay connected. And again, my friends, while this has been a great program, light at the end of the tunnel, we are still in that tunnel. Please wear a mask for your family, for your colleagues, for your doctors, for yourself. The life you may save may be your own. And please come back. Doctor, welcome. Thank you again.